September the 7th, 1940, 20:15 hours, Liverpool Street Underground. Margaret Sullivan descended the escalator carrying her 3-year-old daughter and a single suitcase. She thought they'd stay one night, maybe two, until the bombing stopped. Behind her, 10,000 others had the same plan. None of them knew they were about to spend the next 5 years 130 feet underground, or that Margaret's daughter would celebrate her 8th birthday having never slept in sunlight. The air raid sirens had started at 16:43 that afternoon. Margaret had been hanging washing in her back garden in Bethnal Green when the sound cut through the September sky, that rising and falling wail that every Londoner had learned to dread. She'd grabbed Helen, still in her afternoon dress, thrown a few things into the case, nappies, a change of clothes, Helen's stuffed rabbit, and joined the stream of people heading toward the nearest underground station. Liverpool Street was chaos. The platforms designed to hold perhaps 200 waiting passengers now contained thousands. Families staking claims to sections of concrete floor with blankets and pillows, children crying, elderly people lowering themselves carefully onto the hard ground, station staff trying and failing to maintain some semblance of order. The trains were still running. The government had insisted the underground must continue operating as transport, not transform into a shelter system. So every few minutes, a train would screech into the station and passengers would have to press themselves against the walls while commuters squeezed on and off, stepping over the families camped on the platform. Margaret found a spot near the tunnel entrance, not ideal because of the noise and wind when trains passed, but at least they had a wall to lean against. She spread their single blanket on the concrete, sat Helen down with the rabbit, and tried to calculate how long they'd be there. One night certainly. The raids had been going on for hours, maybe 2 nights if it continued tomorrow. A week at most. Then they'd go home to Bethnal Green, clean up whatever damage the bombs had caused, and return to normal life. 5 years later, Margaret would still be there. Helen would be 8 years old, unable to remember living anywhere else, and Liverpool Street Station would have become something the London Passenger Transport Board had never intended, and the government had tried desperately to prevent. Britain's largest underground city, a subterranean community with its own social structures, its own rules, its own births and deaths and marriages, a civilization that existed in the space between the tunnel walls, while above them London burned and rebuilt and burned again. The mathematics of desperation. The Blitz began on September 7th, 1940. The Luftwaffe had switched strategy, abandoning the attempt to destroy the Royal Air Force and instead targeting London's civilian population, trying to break British morale through terror. Between September 1940 and May 1941, German bombers attacked London on 71 consecutive nights, dropping thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs on the city. The government had not wanted the underground to become a shelter system. Before the war, official policy had been clear. Deep shelters were psychologically dangerous. They would create a shelter mentality that would undermine civilian morale. People would refuse to come up. Productivity would collapse. The London Passenger Transport Board had been instructed to prevent people from using the stations as shelters. Station staff locked the gates early, turned away families seeking refuge, insisted the underground was for transport only. On September 7th, that policy died. 20,000 people forced their way into the stations that first night. Station staff had a choice: stand aside or be trampled. They stood aside. By September 9th, the government accepted reality and issued new guidelines. Stations could be used as shelters, but transport must continue. Trains would keep running. Platforms must remain partially clear. People could shelter on the lower levels of the deepest stations, in the tunnels between stations where possible, but the system had to function. The numbers were staggering. By late September 1940, approximately 177,000 people per night were sleeping in the underground. 79 stations were being used as shelters. Some stations held hundreds, Others, particularly the deep-level stations in the East End, areas most heavily targeted by German bombers, held thousands. Liverpool Street was among the largest. Located at the intersection of multiple lines, with platforms 80 feet below street level and additional tunnels and passages extending even deeper, the station had the capacity to hold enormous numbers if people packed themselves tightly enough. And they did. At its peak, Liverpool Street sheltered more than 10,000 people nightly, a population larger than many British towns, living in a space designed for transit, not habitation. The first weeks. Those early weeks were hell. Margaret Sullivan would remember them with a shudder for the rest of her life, the memories vivid decades later, the smell of unwashed bodies packed too close together in spaces with inadequate ventilation, the sound of children crying throughout the night, the way the platform shook when trains passed, the absolute absence of privacy, the toilets, just buckets behind canvas screens overflowing by midnight, the fights that broke out over space, over noise, over the few benches that people claimed as personal territory. Helen stopped sleeping properly. The 3-year-old would doze fitfully for an hour or two, then wake crying, disoriented by the noise and darkness and strangeness. Other children were the same. The sound of crying echoed through the tunnels, mixing with the adults' conversations, arguments, snoring, the occasional scream when someone had a nightmare, the constant rumble and screech of trains. The authorities were overwhelmed. London County Council had responsibility for public shelters, but the Underground was the London Passenger Transport Board's domain, and neither organisation had planned for this. There were no beds, no sanitation facilities beyond the station toilets, no medical services, no food distribution. The government provided nothing. If you wanted to survive in the Underground, you brought what you needed or did without. People adapted. They started arriving earlier to claim better spots. By mid-September, some families were sending someone to queue from mid-afternoon to secure a pitch on the platform before the evening rush. Margaret began leaving Helen with a neighbour and going to Liverpool Street at 14 Hag, waiting 2 hours to get a spot away from the tunnel entrance where the wind was less brutal. Other families formed alliances, taking turns to queue, sharing space, watching each other's children. The station staff tried to maintain order. They painted white lines on the platforms marking the areas that must remain clear for passengers. They set rules: no camping before 16 AG, everyone up and off the platforms by 07 vowing to allow the morning commute. They tried to keep the tunnels clear, tried to stop people from venturing into the dangerous spaces between stations where live rails could kill. But with 10,000 people flooding into Liverpool Street every evening, enforcement was impossible. Families crept into the tunnels, spreading blankets in the narrow passages, risking electrocution for a bit more space away from the crowded platforms. People ignored the 16:00 rule, arriving earlier and earlier until some never left at all, maintaining permanent residency underground. By October 1940, Liverpool Street Underground station had stopped being a transport hub that doubled as a shelter. It had become a residential space that trains happened to run through. Building a society human societies form quickly under pressure. Within weeks, Liverpool Street had social structures, unwritten rules, hierarchies, and community organisations that nobody had planned, but everyone understood. Territory mattered. The families who'd claimed spots in those first chaotic nights defended their pitches fiercely. Margaret's spot near the Central Line platform, 20 feet from the tunnel entrance, became hers in a way that needed no official recognition. Other families knew. Newcomers were directed elsewhere. If she had to leave during the day, she left a blanket to mark the space, and people respected it. The best spots were the alcoves and recesses in the station walls, spaces that offered a small amount of privacy and protection from the wind when trains passed. These were claimed by families who'd arrived earliest and defended most aggressively. Jerry Matthews, a docker from Stepney, held an alcove on the Northern Line platform with his wife and 4 children. He'd been there since September 7th, first night of the Blitz, and he'd fight anyone who tried to take it. Everyone knew this. Nobody challenged him. Class divisions that might have mattered above ground faded underground. Liverpool Street sheltered dock workers and shop assistants, clerks and housewives. The unemployed and the skilled tradesmen all pressed together on the same concrete. The bank manager slept next to the dustman. The professor's children played with the costermonger's kids. Wealth meant nothing when everyone owned only what they could carry and everyone slept on the same cold platform. But new hierarchies emerged. People who'd been there longest had status. Families with multiple members had more bargaining power. They could hold larger territories, could take shifts guarding their space, could intimidate newcomers. The physically strong, particularly the younger men, commanded respect and fear. Jerry Matthews wasn't important because of his job or education, but because he was large and willing to fight, and everyone knew it. Women formed networks. Margaret became part of a group of mothers with young children who helped each other, watching kids while someone went up to street level for supplies, sharing food when someone ran short, offering comfort when children were sick or frightened. These networks were survival mechanisms. A woman alone with children in the underground was vulnerable. A woman with allies was safer. The station staff became a kind of authority. They had no legal power over the shelterers, but they controlled access to the station facilities. They knew the tunnel systems. They had relationships with the transport police. Smart families stayed on good terms with the platform supervisor. Tom Brennan, who managed the Central Line platforms, could make life easier or harder depending on his mood. He could look the other way when someone broke the rules, or he could have them ejected from the station. People learned to respect him. By November 1940, Liverpool Street had its own internal economy. People traded goods and services. The woman, who'd been a seamstress, repaired clothes in exchange for food. The former electrician fixed torches and improvised lighting. A man who'd worked in a bakery organized a bread-buying cooperative, collecting money from families and negotiating bulk purchases from suppliers near the station, distributing the bread each evening when people arrived. Children formed packs, ranging across the station in groups, creating games that used the tunnels and platforms as their playground. Helen Sullivan, now approaching 4, spent her days with a dozen other children, all roughly the same age, all living in the station. They played chase on the platforms when trains weren't due, explored the passages and alcoves, created elaborate pretend games involving imaginary houses and families and adventures. The older children, 7 and 8 and 9 years old, ventured into areas the adults had forbidden, exploring distant tunnels, daring each other to touch the walls near the live rails, returning with stories of mysterious passages and hidden rooms. The authorities respond. The government watched this development with horror and resignation. Winston Churchill visited several underground stations in September 1940, including Liverpool Street. He walked the platforms, spoke to families, saw children sleeping on concrete, smelled the overflowing toilets, recognized that the official policy had failed completely. Orders went out, improve conditions. If people were going to live in the underground, they needed sanitation, medical care, food, organization. The task fell to multiple agencies: London County Council, the London Passenger Transport Board, local authorities, the Ministry of Health, and the coordination was chaotic, but slowly things improved. Chemical toilets were installed, replacing the buckets. They were still inadequate for 10,000 people, but they were better. Water fountains were set up. First aid posts appeared, staffed by volunteer nurses and doctors. The government began distributing bunk beds, 3-tier metal frames that allowed families to sleep off the ground and maximized the use of vertical space. By early 1941, Liverpool Street had rows of bunks lining the platforms, transforming the visual appearance of the station from a refugee camp to something more permanent, more organized, more like a barracks. Canteens opened. The government contracted with catering companies to provide meals for shelterers. At Liverpool Street, a large canteen operated in one of the unused passages, serving tea, soup, sandwiches for a few pence. For families like the Sullivans, this was a lifeline. Margaret no longer had to carry all their food from home. She could buy a hot meal in the evening, feed Helen properly, save the energy of preparing food in their tiny space on the platform. Entertainment arrived. The Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, which would later become the Arts Council, organised concerts in the larger stations. Musicians performed on the platforms, singers gave recitals, actors staged abbreviated plays. Liverpool Street had a concert most weeks, usually on Saturday evenings, when the platforms were most crowded. People would gather around makeshift stages, sitting on their bunks or standing in the aisles between the beds, listening to classical music or popular songs or dramatic readings while trains continued to rumble past every few minutes. A lending library opened, stocked with donated books. Children's education became a concern. Schools above ground were closed or damaged. Children were living underground. They needed teaching. Volunteer teachers organised classes in the passages, teaching reading and arithmetic to groups of kids sitting on the floor using donated slates and chalk, working around the train schedule. By mid-1941, Liverpool Street Underground station had amenities that many above-ground neighbourhoods lacked. The shelterers had access to free medical care, subsidised food, entertainment, education. The station had become not just a shelter, but a service hub, a community centre, a place that provided for its residents in ways the destroyed neighbourhoods above could not. Life in the dark, Helen Sullivan turned 4 in March 1941. She'd been living in Liverpool Street for 6 months. She had no clear memories of life before the underground. When Margaret tried to remind her of their house in Bethnal Green, Helen looked confused. Home was the bunk on the Central Line platform. Home was the smell of the chemical toilets and the sound of trains and the taste of canteen soup. The children adapted better than the adults. For Helen and the other young ones, this was normal. They didn't know life should be different. They played in the tunnels, slept on the bunks, attended the underground schools, and accepted it all as simply how things were. The older children, those who'd been 7 or 8 when the Blitz began, and had clear memories of houses and gardens and sunlight, struggled more. They understood what they'd lost. Margaret watched Helen's development with growing concern. The child was pale, rarely saw daylight, had no space to run or play properly. She was developing a persistent cough, like many of the underground children, from the poor air quality and dampness. Her behaviour was changing too. She was clingy, anxious when separated from Margaret even briefly, frightened of loud noises, unable to sleep without the sound of trains. But what choice did Margaret have? Their house in Bethnal Green had been damaged by a bomb in October 1940. The roof was gone, windows shattered, structurally unsafe. Even if she'd wanted to return, there was nowhere to return to. And Bethnal Green was still being bombed regularly. Liverpool Street, for all its discomforts, was safe. The bombs couldn't reach them 80 feet underground. Other families made different calculations. Some left after a few weeks, deciding to take their chances above ground rather than endure the underground's conditions. Others stayed temporarily, leaving when the bombing intensity decreased, returning to damaged homes or relocating to areas outside London. But many, like Margaret, had nowhere else to go. They stayed not entirely by choice, but because the alternatives were worse. The long-term residents developed routines. Margaret's day followed a pattern. Wake around 6:30, pack up their bedding, take Helen to the toilet facilities, wash faces at the water fountain, eat breakfast, usually bread and margarine she'd brought from home or purchased from one of the vendors who operated on the platforms. By 07A, they had to clear out to allow the morning commute. Margaret would take Helen up to street level, spend a few hours outside when weather permitted, visiting a park or walking the damaged streets, getting what sunlight and fresh air they could. At midday, she'd buy food for their evening meal. By 14, she was back at Liverpool Street, queuing for entry, reclaiming their bunk, settling in for another night. The evenings had a rhythm. The platforms filled between 16 and 20 as shelterers arrived. Families prepared evening meals, either food they'd brought or purchases from the canteen. Children played until lights out at 22:30. Adults talked, read, played cards, listened to the radio if someone had one. Couples found privacy where they could, retreating to distant passages for brief moments alone. Babies were conceived in Liverpool Street Station, awkward couplings in dark corners, marriages maintained under impossible conditions. The nights were long. The lights dimmed, but never fully out. The station still operated, trains still ran, maintenance workers still needed to see. Sleep was difficult. The sounds never stopped. Trains, conversations, crying children, the occasional argument, the coughs and snores of thousands of people. The air was stale, thick with body odour and smoke from the cigarettes everyone seemed to smoke despite the poor ventilation. Margaret lay awake many nights, Helen pressed against her on the narrow bunk, listening to the sounds of the underground city, wondering how long this would continue, whether they'd ever have a proper home again, whether Helen would grow up normal or be permanently damaged by these years in the dark. The community organises. By late 1941, Liverpool Street had formal organisation. The shelterers elected a shelter committee, representatives from different areas of the station who met weekly to discuss problems and negotiate with the authorities. Jerry Matthews represented the Northern Line platforms. A woman named Edith Morrison spoke for the families in the deep tunnels. Others represented different sections, different interests. The committee had no legal authority, but it had practical power. The station staff and local officials recognized that dealing with elected representatives was easier than trying to manage 10,000 individuals. When the committee said families needed better sanitation, the authorities listened. When the committee organized work parties to clean the platforms, the station staff cooperated. When disputes arose between families, the committee mediated. Social rules became more formal. The committee established quiet hours, designated smoking areas, created a rotation system for the limited number of bunks near the better ventilated passages. They organised celebrations. Christmas 1941 saw a party on the Central Line platform, donated toys distributed to children, carols sung, an attempt at normalcy in extraordinary circumstances. Helen Sullivan received a doll donated by some charity organisation. She named it Margaret after her mother and carried it everywhere, a small piece of childhood in the underground city. The doll became grimy quickly, its dress stained by the dirt that was inescapable in the station, but Helen loved it fiercely, slept with it clutched to her chest, talked to it during the long evenings. The bombing continued through 1941, but became less frequent after May, when Hitler redirected the Luftwaffe toward the Soviet Union. Summer 1941 brought hope that perhaps the worst was over, that people could begin returning to normal life above ground. Some families left Liverpool Street, reclaiming damaged homes or relocating to safer areas. But many stayed. Margaret stayed because her house remained uninhabitable and she had no money for alternative accommodation. Jerry Matthews stayed because the docks were still targeted occasionally and his Stepney home was in a high-risk area. Edith Morrison stayed because her husband was in the Navy and she couldn't face living alone in their empty house in Hackney. Thousands stayed because the underground had become home, because the community they'd built meant something, because after a year of living together they'd formed bonds that couldn't easily be broken. By late 1941, Liverpool Street Station had residents who'd been there for more than a year, children who'd spent formative months or years underground, a established social structure and an identity as a place rather than just a shelter. The transport staff stopped calling people shelterers and started calling them residents. Officials stopped talking about temporary accommodation and started planning for long-term occupation. The government installed better bunks, proper beds with thin mattresses instead of just metal frames. They improved the ventilation systems, brought in more powerful fans to circulate air through the crowded platforms. They established proper medical facilities, a clinic with a nurse on duty every evening, a doctor visiting several times a week. Liverpool Street was no longer just enduring. It was functioning as an underground community with infrastructure and services. The war continues. 1942 brought new challenges. The Blitz had ended, but bombing continued sporadically. The Luftwaffe conducted hit-and-run raids, smaller attacks that kept Londoners nervous and ensured the underground populations remained high. Liverpool Street's population stabilised around 7,000 to 8,000 nightly, down from the peak of 10,000, but still enormous. Helen Sullivan turned 5 in March 1942. She'd lived more than half her life underground. She attended one of the underground schools, now sitting with a dozen other children in a passage off the Northern Line platform, learning to read and write and do basic arithmetic from a volunteer teacher named Miss Patterson. The education was rudimentary, but it was something. Helen learned her letters, began reading simple books from the lending library, showed her mother proudly when she could write her own name. Margaret worried constantly about Helen's health. The child was thin, pale, coughed frequently. The underground doctor said many of the children had similar issues: respiratory problems from the poor air quality, vitamin deficiencies from lack of sunlight, developmental concerns from the cramped living conditions. But what could Margaret do? They had nowhere else to go. She made sure Helen went above ground every day for at least a few hours, tried to feed her properly despite rationing and limited resources, hoped it would be enough. The social dynamics of the station had settled into patterns. The long-term residents, families who'd been there since 1940, formed a kind of aristocracy. The established families everyone knew. Newcomers were still arriving, people bombed out of their homes in the periodic raids, or those who tried living above ground and couldn't manage. These new arrivals were assigned spaces by the shelter committee, usually the least desirable spots near the tunnel entrances or in the most crowded sections. Tensions existed. The long-term residents sometimes resented the newcomers, felt they hadn't earned the right to the hard-won amenities and organization. The newcomers felt excluded, struggled to integrate into established social networks. The committee mediated disputes, tried to maintain fairness, but frictions were inevitable when thousands of people lived in close quarters for years. Romance flourished. Young people met, courted under impossible conditions, fell in love in the tunnels. Several couples who'd met in Liverpool Street Station got married in 1942. Ceremonies held above ground, but receptions celebrated underground, families gathering on the platforms, sharing precious rationed food and drink, dancing to music from a gramophone someone had brought, making joy where they could find it. Babies continued to be born. Pregnant women sheltering in Liverpool Street would go to hospital for delivery, then return with newborns to their bunks on the platforms. Several infants spent their first months of life underground, sleeping in makeshift cradles next to their parents' bunks, growing up hearing the sound of trains as their lullaby. Deaths occurred too. The elderly and sick struggled in the underground's conditions. Several of Liverpool Street's residents died in 1942, mostly older people whose health couldn't withstand the damp and stress. The bodies were removed quietly, funerals held above ground, but everyone knew death was part of the underground city's reality. The tide turns. By 1943, the war's momentum had shifted. The immediate threat to Britain had passed. The Luftwaffe was focused on other fronts. Bombing of London was rare. The government began encouraging people to leave the underground shelters, to reclaim homes, to return to normal life. Many left. The population of Liverpool Street dropped to around 5,000 nightly in early 1943, then to 3,000 by summer. Families returned to repaired homes, relocated to other areas, decided to risk living above ground. The platforms that had been packed solid now had empty bunks, spaces where families had lived for years now vacant, but a core population remained. Margaret Sullivan was among them. She'd been at Liverpool Street for nearly 3 years. Helen was 6 years old, knew no other home. Their house in Bethnal Green had been demolished while they were underground, too damaged to repair, torn down for salvage. Margaret had no home to return to. She was waiting for council housing, on a list with thousands of other bombed-out families, told it might be months or years before accommodation became available. She could have left London, evacuated to the countryside like many families were still doing. But Margaret's entire life was in East London. Her family was there. Her mother, her sister, cousins and aunts and uncles. Her late husband was buried in a cemetery in Bow. She couldn't imagine leaving, starting over somewhere unfamiliar. So she stayed in Liverpool Street, living on the platform, raising Helen in the underground, waiting for something to change. Others stayed for similar reasons. Some had nowhere to go. Some preferred the underground safety to the anxiety of living above ground. Some had become so accustomed to the community, the routine, the known difficulties of station life that the prospect of leaving was more frightening than staying. By late 1943, Liverpool Street Station had 2 distinct populations: the temporary shelterers, people who came during raids or occasionally for various reasons, and the permanent residents, families who'd been there for years and showed no signs of leaving. The permanent residents numbered perhaps 2,000, living in the deeper tunnels and the better appointed sections of the station, claiming the best bunks, running the community organisations. The war continued but felt distant. News came of fighting in Italy, in the Pacific, in Russia, but for the residents of Liverpool Street, the war was something that happened elsewhere. Their war had been the Blitz, and that was over. Now they were just living, surviving, waiting for peace and the chance to rebuild normal lives. The final years, 1944, brought renewed danger. The V-1 flying bombs began falling on London in June, pilotless aircraft that crashed randomly across the city, their distinctive buzzing engines becoming a new source of terror. Later came the V-2 rockets, supersonic weapons that gave no warning, just sudden enormous explosions. The underground populations swelled again. Liverpool Street's platforms refilled with frightened families seeking shelter from weapons that came without warning. By summer 1944, the station was again housing 6,000 to 7,000 people nightly. The bunks all occupied, the passages crowded. Helen Sullivan was 7 years old. She'd lived 4 years underground. She was in the underground school, studying with Miss Patterson, reading competently now, able to do arithmetic, learning about history and geography from lessons conducted in a tunnel passage with borrowed books and makeshift supplies. Her world was the station. She knew the platforms intimately, knew which passages led where, knew the names of hundreds of other residents, could navigate the complex underground geography better than many adults. Margaret watched her daughter and grieved for the childhood Helen had lost. 7 years old, and she'd spent more than half her life 80 feet below street level, breathing stale air, sleeping on a bunk in a public space, never having her own room or garden or normal life. But what could Margaret do? The V-weapons made above ground even more dangerous than during the Blitz. At least in the underground they were safe. The community had matured. Liverpool Street had its own culture now, its own traditions and stories and shared history. People spoke of the early days, those chaotic weeks in September 1940, with a kind of nostalgia, remembering how much worse it had been, how far they'd come. The Christmas celebrations were established traditions organised by the Shelter Committee, featuring donated toys and special meals and entertainment. The lending library had expanded to hundreds of books. The underground school taught dozens of children. The clinic provided regular medical care. The canteen served hot meals daily. In some ways, Liverpool Street offered its residents better services than they might have had above ground. The medical care was free and regular. The food, while rationed and basic, was guaranteed and affordable. The education for children was consistent. The community support networks meant people looked after each other, helped in times of trouble, provided company and comfort. But the price was freedom and privacy and normalcy. No one had their own space. Every moment was public, visible to thousands of others. The noise never stopped. The air was always stale. Natural light was something you experienced for a few hours when you went above ground, then gave up again when you descended to the station. May 1945 brought victory in Europe. The war was over. London celebrated. Above ground, people danced in the streets, hung bunting, threw parties. In Liverpool Street Station, residents gathered to listen to Churchill's broadcast on borrowed radios, cheered and cried and hugged each other, celebrated the end of 6 years of war, and then they went to bed on their bunks on the platform. Because even though the war was over, they still had nowhere else to go. The aftermath. The government wanted people out of the underground stations. Victory meant return to normalcy, and normalcy didn't include thousands of people living permanently in train stations. The Ministry of Health issued notices. The shelters would close. Everyone must leave. Housing would be provided. The government was building prefabricated homes, temporary accommodation for bombed-out families. But the process was slow. There weren't enough prefabs. The waiting lists were enormous, and some residents didn't want to leave. They'd built lives in Liverpool Street. The community meant something. The prospect of being relocated to an unfamiliar prefab in an unfamiliar neighborhood, separated from people they'd lived alongside for 5 years, was unwelcome. The population declined gradually through 1945 and 1946. Families accepted housing offers and left. The platforms emptied. The bunks were dismantled and removed. The medical clinic closed. The canteen shut down. The underground schools ended as children were enrolled in proper schools above ground. Margaret Sullivan received her housing offer in July 1946. A prefabricated house in Dagenham, Essex. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom. Their own space finally after 6 years of living publicly. She accepted immediately. On her last evening in Liverpool Street, Margaret walked the platforms with Helen, saying goodbye to people they'd lived alongside for years. Jerry Matthews and his family were leaving the next week. Edith Morrison had left months earlier. Miss Patterson had returned to teaching in a proper school. The community was dissolving, people scattering across London and beyond, the underground city ending not with drama but with gradual departure. Helen, now 8 years old, didn't understand why they were leaving. Liverpool Street was home. The bunk on the Central Line platform was where she'd lived as long as she could remember. The tunnels were her neighbourhood. The other children were her friends. Margaret tried to explain about the house, about having their own space, about normal life, but Helen was confused and sad. They took the train to Dagenham on July the 20th, 1946, 6 years almost to the day since they'd first descended into Liverpool Street Station. They carried their possessions in the same battered suitcase, plus a few additional bags accumulated over the years. Helen clutched her doll, the one she'd received at Christmas 1941, now grimy and worn but treasured. The prefab was small, temporary looking, made of aluminum and asbestos like 1,000 others, but it was theirs. Helen had her own bedroom. They had a kitchen where Margaret could cook properly, a bathroom with running water, windows that let in natural light. Helen struggled to adjust. She was frightened of sleeping alone in her bedroom, anxious about the silence and darkness. She missed the sounds of trains and thousands of people. She missed her friends from the underground. She had nightmares about being lost, separated from her mother in the tunnels. Margaret struggled too. The isolation was difficult after years of constant company. The prefab felt empty, quiet, almost too spacious after the cramped bunk. She missed the community, the networks of women who'd supported each other, the sense of shared experience. But gradually, they adapted. Helen started school in Dagenham, made new friends, began sleeping through the night. Margaret found work in a local factory, earned money, started rebuilding a life above ground. The memories of Liverpool Street faded from immediate reality to story, something that had happened to them, extraordinary years that shaped them but no longer defined their daily existence. The legacy. Liverpool Street Underground station returned to normal operations in late 1946. The bunks were gone, the facilities dismantled, the passages cleared. Trains ran without navigating around sleeping families. The platforms held only waiting passengers again, people going about ordinary business, but the walls carried marks. Graffiti scratched by bored children during long evenings, stains on the concrete where thousands of people had lived, small remnants of the underground city that had existed there, a forgotten toy, a bit of old rope someone had used to mark territory, scratches showing where bunks had been bolted to the floor. The people who'd lived there carried their own marks. Helen Sullivan grew up with memories that few others shared, stories of childhood spent 80 feet underground, of learning to read in a tunnel, of playing with friends on train platforms, of the sound of trains as the constant background to life. She was forever shaped by those years, carrying a particular resilience, a particular understanding of survival and community, and making do with what you have. Margaret never spoke much about the underground years. When people asked where she'd lived during the war, she said simply, "We sheltered in Liverpool Street." She didn't elaborate, didn't describe the reality of years spent on a platform, raising a child in public, living without privacy or space or normalcy. It was too difficult to explain to people who hadn't experienced it, and she wasn't sure she wanted to remember it all herself. Across London, tens of thousands of others carried similar memories. The people who'd lived in Bethnal Green Station, in Elephant and Castle, in all the dozens of underground shelters. They'd formed communities underground, survived years in conditions nobody would choose, made lives in impossible circumstances. Their children had grown up in the tunnels, carried the experience into adulthood, passed stories to their own children and grandchildren. Historians would later study the underground shelters as examples of civilian resilience during wartime. Sociologists would analyze the community formation, the social structures that emerged, the ways people organized themselves in crisis. Politicians would cite the shelters as evidence of British determination and adaptability. But for the people who'd actually lived there, it was simpler and more complex than that. They'd done what they had to do. They'd survived. They'd found ways to maintain humanity in inhumane conditions. They'd protected their children and supported their neighbours and endured because there was no alternative. Liverpool Street Station had been designed to move people through the city, to connect them to destinations, to facilitate London's transportation network. For 5 years, it had instead been a destination itself, a place where people lived and died and were born and grew up and fell in love and grieved and celebrated and simply existed. 10,000 people at the peak, living in a space never meant for habitation, creating an underground city that shouldn't have worked but did. The aluminum prefabs the government built to rehouse the bombed-out families were supposed to last 10 years. Many stood for 30 or 40, becoming permanent homes despite their temporary design. The underground shelters were supposed to be temporary too, emergency accommodation for a few weeks until the bombing stopped. Instead, they lasted 5 years, became communities, shaped lives. Britain during the war years was a nation of improvisation, of making do, of solutions that weren't solutions but were the best available and would have to be enough. The prefabs were that. The underground cities were that. Aluminum boxes and train platforms becoming homes because homes were needed and nothing better was possible. Margaret Sullivan died in 1994, having lived long past the war years, past the prefab years, into comfortable retirement in a proper house in Essex. Helen was with her at the end. They didn't talk much about Liverpool Street by then. It was 50 years past, a different life, a different world. But sometimes Helen would ride the Underground, change trains at Liverpool Street, stand on the platform waiting for her connection. She'd look at the walls, the concrete floor, the curved ceiling, and remember sleeping on a bunk right here, learning to read in that passage, playing with friends in these tunnels. Remember her mother, young and strong and frightened, protecting her daughter in the only way possible. Remember thousands of others doing the same, all of them surviving together. The trains would come and go. Passengers would board and alight, hurrying to work or home or wherever they needed to be, living their ordinary lives. And Helen would remember when this platform had been home to thousands, when the tunnels had held an entire underground city, when ordinary life had seemed impossibly distant, and survival was the only goal that mattered. The war had ended, the underground city had dispersed, the people had moved on, but the memory remained, carried by those who'd lived it, passed to those who came after. A story of survival and community and endurance that was neither triumph nor tragedy, but something in between. Human beings doing what they had to do, making homes in impossible places, living through extraordinary times, and emerging changed but whole. That was enough. It had to be enough. And somehow it was.